Good morning, everybody. Very brave coming out in this rainy weather, huh? Everybody make it okay? Driving through puddles. Our fearless leader, Beth and my son, Trevor, and his lovely wife are on a little holiday this weekend celebrating, actually today, their second wedding anniversary. So that's why they're not with us. As you know, we've been studying through different books of the Bible. Today we start the letter that Paul wrote to the church in Colossae. We just finished, as you know, the book of Philippians, which was another book that Paul wrote from prison. So this is one of the books that Paul wrote, one of the letters he wrote from prison in Rome. Actually, Colossians' letter was written earlier than the Philippian letter. He was in prison in Rome for about 2 years, and the book of Philippians was written later, near the end of that 2-year time of confinement. This one, along with the book of Ephesians and the small little letter to Philemon, were written closer together around AD 60-61. So we're going to talk about the first chapter of Colossians, and I'm going to give a little overview of the book too for you, just so you get some introduction, and we'll spend the next 4 weeks, 4 chapters, looking at the book of Colossians. I'm kind of titling my message, Discovering Heaven in a Roman Prison, or Discovering Heaven in Hell. So the town of Colossae, the city, is a once key city in what we now call Turkey. In Bible times it was called Asia Minor. If you can picture the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, this area of Asia Minor would be directly on the northern side. The Mediterranean Sea is loosely a rectangular shape running horizontally on the map. And this would be in that northern sector. Colossae was a leading city in Asia Minor before the time of Paul, actually several hundred years before the time of Paul in this time. But by the 1st century after Christ, and when Paul was doing his missionary work, Colossae had diminished in its importance and become kind of a second-rate market town, surpassed in power by 2 neighboring cities very close by, the cities of Laodicea and Hierapolis. Just a little background. So while Paul was earlier on, he was ministering, and if you remember when we studied through the book of Acts, Paul spent 2 years in the city of Ephesus. And while he was in Ephesus, a young man named Epaphras was converted by Paul. And Epaphras carried the gospel to Colossae. So here Paul is in prison, and he's writing to Colossae. He's never visited the city. He's never been to Colossae in his life. But he has relational connections with the city through Epaphras. And so this young church was planted by this young man. And ironically, Epaphras also was instrumental in planting churches in both Laodicea and Hierapolis. And Paul didn't write letters that we know of to those cities, to the churches in those cities, but in fact some of these letters that we are studying were passed around from city to city, and that's in part how they became known as part of what we call our Bible today. One of the challenges that happened in Colossae was they came under some heretical, erroneous teaching attacks by some very enthusiastic Jews who were living in the area. These churches were primarily Gentile, but there were some enthusiastic Jews who were bringing in some of their traditions, some of their ceremonial traditions, some of their ascetic kind of lifestyles, and imposing these things on the church in Colossae. And Paul was writing in part to counter some of these influences. He was trying to develop a personal relationship with this church, having never visited there. Hence, when we get to chapter 4, you'll notice there's a tone in chapter 4 that is referencing people that he knows, Tychicus, Onesimus, and these different people, Epaphras, and he's trying to build a relational connection with the church. So Paul isn't this kind of authority guy that just wants to go around and exercising his apostolic authority. He's really trying to be relationship-based. But he does have something he wants to accomplish in writing this letter because he is troubled by some of the things he's hearing. And in fact, Epaphras had come from Colossae to Rome to visit Paul in prison, bringing news to Paul of some of these troubles he was experiencing in Colossae. I kind of think about that, when I was a young man and in missions work in Asia, and we'd go through some difficult experiences. We would occasionally travel, but we have the conveniences of phone calls, and now we have email and all these other ways of contacting people. So you call somebody who you look up to say, can you help me with this problem I'm having? That was what Epaphras was doing. And he traveled a long distance. He traveled a huge distance over land and sea to get to Paul in Rome to ask his papa, his apostolic authority, his overseer, or the man he looked up to, the older guy, and say, I'm having a little trouble with some people in my church. Can you kind of help me? And so Paul writes this letter, and he sends it back with a couple guys, Tychicus and then Onesimus, and he sends them back to the church to give them some instructions. So what's the big idea of Colossians? You see in this chapter, Paul uses big words and long sentences. When I read it, it's like, won't you ever come up to take a breath? Verses 3 through, I think it's 6, is one big long sentence. 3 through 8, one big long sentence, separated by commas and dashes. It's like he just goes on and on and on and on and on. So Paul's writing style is very unique. Scholars talk about this writing style in this book is unique, and some of the things he says are interesting. One of the other things I think is really important for us to remember is the fact that Paul wrote this letter from Rome. And, I don't know if anybody in this room has ever spent any time in prison. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. But obviously, prison has given Paul a lot of time to reflect and to think and to ponder and to pray and to recenter himself on what is important. All the distractions and the superficiality of freedom are removed, and Paul is free to focus on eternal, transcendent things. And I think we have to keep that in mind, that this context helped him answer the questions that this particular church were struggling with. In a lot of ways, we may not be experiencing the same things that the church in Colossae experienced, but we live in monstrously distracted times. We could use a little prison time every now and then. Think about it. I often long, for a little bit of prison time. It's like, couldn't we just turn the phone off, turn everything off, and not have anybody coming after me? Paul had to go to prison, and they still came asking for his advice. We call these times vacation. We leave our busy lives, we turn the phones off and disconnect from the internet, and we do something difficult on vacation. A lot of us, young people especially. You go on a hike, you climb a mountain, you go camping. Instead of buying food at the supermarket, you go hunting, Why do we do this? There's something about simplification that gets us back to what's important. And we come home recentered and refreshed. Years before this experience in prison, Paul had a dynamic experience with Jesus. He was stopped on a road on his way to persecute Christians. And Jesus stopped him. We know that now as the Damascus Road experience that Paul had. It's recorded in Acts chapter 9. Now, Paul had already had a lot of insight at that point in his life. He had been trained under Jewish leadership and Jewish tutelage, so he was familiar with the Old Testament. He was not ignorant of this monotheistic Abrahamic faith that had come forward through history. He was very knowledgeable of these things. The missing component, of course, was the Messiah. In Acts 9, he found Jesus and had such a profound experience with Christ that he wrote later, he said, "I have suffered the loss of all things so that I might have Jesus." He never lost that primary, singular, centered focus in his life. You see that here in this book as he tries to help this young church in the Colossian church to come to terms with what distractions do we pay attention to? What teachings, what influences that are coming at us are important? So prison helped him sharpen himself and his insights. This letter contains, most scholars will say this, the letter contains some of the most lofty and superlative declarations about who Jesus is in the New Testament. We read them this morning. They're amazing. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But the first thing that the chapter opens up in is Paul's praying. He prays these amazing prayers. And we talked about this when we studied the book of Philippians, how Paul is in prison. It's not very pleasant. I studied a little bit to understand Roman prisons, and they were not nice places to be. Often they were dug in holes underground, so they were dark, they were damp, they were stinky because of both animal, rat infestation, and human feces. Unhealthy places to live, unpleasant places to live. You weren't in prison to be comforted. And yet Paul prays. He's not requesting prayer, he's praying for others. How is this possible? Look at the prayer that he prays, starting in verse 3. He says he's praying that God would fill you with the knowledge of his will, that God would give you all wisdom and spiritual understanding. Verse 10, so that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way. This is what he's thinking about. That you would bear fruit in every good work. You would increase in the knowledge of God. Verse 11, you would be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might. And that word might is the word dunamis, from which we get the word dynamite. It means this power of God. So you might have great endurance. In other words, there is going to be some tough times. Paul isn't praying that they would all be removed, but that you would have endurance. That there's qualities that you would learn in and through them. He's praying this for them. You would give thanks to the Father. That in itself is amazing. Thankfulness is not something that we tend to lean into during tough times. It's the opposite. We complain. We whine. Verse 12, God, the Father, who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. All these things, these transcendent things, are on Paul's mind in prison, and he's praying for the people of Colossae. We all wish we could pray like this. We all wish that somebody was praying for us like this. Let's look again now going on. What does he declare about Jesus? These lofty things he says about Jesus. Verse 15. He's the image of the invisible God. By him all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible. He's establishing a basic concept of Trinity here. He is before all things, and in him all things are held together. He is the beginning. He is the first to be resurrected. And you think, wait a minute, I thought Lazarus was raised from the dead before Jesus. Well, there's a difference between being risen from the dead and resurrection is when those who are resurrected, they don't die again. Okay? A little theological paraphrase, a little theological parentheses for you. We're all going to get resurrected at the end. If we die in this body, if there's going to be an end time when we will be resurrected. So Jesus was the first to be resurrected. In everything, he has supremacy. Amazing superlative statement. God is pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, in Jesus. Verse 20, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven. And like Jesus is a superhero. The superhero. And he's making us like him, on his team, in his tribe, part of his inner circle. We have redemption, forgiveness through Jesus. We have been delivered from this domain of darkness. Talk about, that sounds like a movie script. And we have been transferred from the domain of darkness into the kingdom of his Son. So Paul, describes Jesus all this lofty language, Christ's preeminence, his all-sufficiency, at the center of the universe as the active creator, but also as the invader of creation. I think that's interesting. Jesus is transcendent, but he's also incarnate. One of the things that makes Christianity so unique compared to many other religions is God. If he is transcendent, he's also aloof. He's unreachable, untouchable, almost uncaring. He's above such mundane things as care. Jesus is different. He's transcendent, but he's the invader. He's incarnate, taking on human flesh. Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. So if you see Jesus, you're seeing God. I don't think he's necessarily meaning physical attributes as much as qualities of character. He contains within himself the fullness of deity. It says in chapter 2. We'll get to that next week. Jesus is sovereign above all things with an authority given him to by God the Father. He's the head over the church. These are all things that are in this book. He has reconciled all things to himself through his death on the cross, making believers alive to God and setting them on a path to right living. So this view of Jesus that Paul is giving to the church in Colossae is somewhat for them an antidote for this erroneous teachings that are coming into the church. Paul is writing this in the first chapter. He's lifting Jesus up very high, and he's lofty, transcendent definitions of who Jesus is, and he's doing this as an antidote for a problem. We in our culture today need that kind of antidote, if you think about it. The world is throwing a lot of stuff at us. We are bombarded with confusing messages. We're pulled on by conflicting loyalties and ideologies. And we're compromised by our own internal battles. And like the Colossians, the question for us is, why, when we have received Christ freely, would we trade away that superhero status he's given us for something else? What allure, really, does the world have for us, comparatively? What does the world offer that even comes close to Jesus and his promises? If you really think about it. This is what Paul was pondering in prison when all the world's things were taken away and he had nothing left but to ponder his relationship with God. If we think about it today, we live in a very prosperous society compared to the world. We have almost anything we want at our disposal. As Trevor said in one of his messages earlier, I'm rich. He had this insight. I'm rich. Compared to almost any other nation in the world, I have more than most people around the world have. I have a car, I own a house, I got all the food I need, I got plenty of appliances, I got a washing machine, I got money in the bank. I'm rich. If you think about it, most of us, this is our experience. We have all these things. We're not actually lacking anything that we actually need to survive and thrive. We're surrounded by safety, friendships, meaning at our disposal, and yet for many of us there's still this discontent. There's just something still grinding at us. What thing can we buy, or friend can we make, or status that we can achieve, or place that we can go that offers any comparable benefit to what Jesus Christ has actually given to us freely? This is what Paul discovered in prison. This is what he knew, and this is the reason he wrote the letter to the Colossians. James Dobson, the founder of Focus on the Family, once told a story about his middle-class life in America, declaring that it isn't everything that he expected it to be once he achieved it. Wife, kids, nice home, He went to Sears one day, he said, to buy a swing set for his kids. This is when he was younger and all his kids were younger. He'd seen an ad in Sears in the newspaper about this beautiful swing set, and he decided to go to Sears and buy it. When he got to the store to pick it up, he said, the thing didn't look at all like it was pictured in the ad. It was in boxes. I had to drag these boxes out to my car and push them in the back of his van. I guess he had a van. And then when I got them home, I opened them up, and there was this instruction manual the size of a telephone, directory. It took me all day to put the thing together. And when I was finished, the final pages of the instructions said this: caution, within 2 weeks of assembly, retighten all bolts. Afterwards, every 30 days, recheck all bolts for proper tightness and lubricate all moving parts. Dobson says, do you know what this is saying to me? It's saying that I must spend every Saturday for the rest of my life maintaining this swing set, or it will gobble up my children. So sometimes our wealth and our prosperity and all the things we have kind of take away from us, don't actually add to us. We are all tempted to allow lesser things preempt Jesus' place in our lives. The amount of stuff that comes at us today that is designed to distract us, allure us, entice us, and motivate us to spend money, to do something, to be somebody, to go somewhere, to look for something, is almost overwhelming. We're swimming in stimulation. Like here, yesterday, I like to look at a couple different apps to read news, and it's almost overwhelming the amount of news that's coming at us today. You don't even have to turn the TV on. So I went to one of my apps, and here are yesterday's cover stories, just yesterday's, from one news source. Number one, the richest man in tech has 65 times the wealth of the richest woman. These are just headliners. Number two, Britain's 2015 election polls show closest result in a generation. Number three, 5 Facebook tricks you never knew existed. Number 4, Iran says Saudi Arabia, quote, sowing seeds of hatred, unquote. Number 5, thousands of kids opt out of standardized Common Core tests across the U.S. Number 6, Pebble smart straps are coming, and here's what they might do. Number 7, Canada's banks form consortium to deal with Apple Pay. Number 8, ship collision delays traffic in Suez Canal. Number 9, Everest avalanche, tributes paid to victims 1 year on. Number 10, Google shaking up search for recommendations on smartphones. Number 11, rights group says Yemen fighting has damaged hospital. And finally, number 12, Mark Zuckerberg defends internet.org in India. That's just the first 12. I know what some of you are thinking. I'd like to read a couple of those articles. So the church in Colossae was under this attack from false teachers who were basically minimizing Jesus. They were saying he was not actually God, or they were saying he isn't that important. What really is important, and chapter 2 unpacks this more than chapter 1, and I'm just going to go through this list, but they were pressing the Colossian church to be more ceremonial. You know, the stuff that emphasizes strict rules, permissible foods and drink, religious festivals, circumcision, these kind of Jewish things. Some of them were pushing towards what Paul called false humility. We would call it asceticism, stuff that emphasizes unnecessary self-denial, kind of will worship. I can be something if I don't handle, don't touch, don't taste. Majoring on minors, Paul talks about, stuff that's focused on secondary, even stupid issues. One of them he mentions in chapter 2 is the worship of angels. Cultish things, secret knowledge, I know something you don't know kind of ideas. Weird claims to have secret knowledge. A lot of our movies are based on this idea that there's some conspiracy, there's a government entity that's doing something. There's a secret out there that nobody knows, but we've got the inside. These things attract us and distract us. Paul said there is no secret knowledge. Paul said it's been revealed in Jesus. There was a mystery, but it's been revealed in Jesus Christ. It's not hidden anymore. And that revelation says in this chapter, the mystery that's been revealed, what is that mystery? It's Christ in you, the hope of glory. Wow. Religious pride was another one, and the biggest was Jesus isn't a big deal. Some of the, I don't think that list in chapter 2 is necessarily the stuff that we struggle with as much. Some of them are, but the things that we struggle with in our highly secularized society, we're rather tempted to worship not at the altars of ceremonialism and asceticism, but really at the altars of pleasure, of beauty, of money, and status. Our culture tells us these gods will bring us happiness and meaning. But actually, they don't. A wise woman once said that the only thing a woman's magazine does for women is to make them feel ugly. In fact, even Cindy Crawford once said that it takes her 4 hours in front of a mirror doing makeup and hair to become Cindy Crawford. O.J. Simpson, one of the most famous running backs in football history, said before his fall from grace, he said this: all the money and fame doesn't bring the happiness it advertises. He had all this money and notoriety he'd ever need. He could have lived a life of luxury. He was a celebrity god. But he was miserable. In 1994, he was accused of brutally murdering his estranged wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and a friend of the family, Ronald Goldman, in Los Angeles with a knife. The trial became the most widely televised trial in American history and lasted almost an entire year. O.J. was ultimately exonerated, even though almost the entire world believed he was guilty. One of his attorneys was a man named Robert Kardashian, the father of the Kardashian girls, and that's how they became famous. In 1997, a few years later, the Nicole Simpson side of the family, the murdered wife, filed a civil suit against O.J. Simpson for wrongful death, and they were awarded over $45 million, and they ruined him financially. A few years later, Simpson was arrested in Las Vegas trying to steal some of his football memorabilia. He was convicted of armed robbery and is now serving a 33-year sentence in Nevada. Wow. Obviously, it's an extreme example, but the fact is we're all capable of getting sidetracked. We're all capable of buying into something that doesn't actually reward us the way it advertises. When we run after the world's promises and we buy into idols and gods the ways of men, Paul says in chapter 2, he says, people like that have lost connection with the head. Our modern cliche, that person that's lost their head, isn't really far off from the truth. Paul said it a long time ago. So our view of Jesus and our relationship with Jesus is important. Paul discovered this and made this case in here. He insisted that this knowledge of who Jesus is and what he's done, it's not a secret, but it has to be searched out. It's the power that dispenses all of our fears. It's the substance that fills every gap in our souls. It's the promise of every hope that we have, every aspiration. It's the power and strength we need to live an enriched life. It's God's provisionary source for every need we have that is so abundant that it gives us enough left over to share with others. And that was Paul's life. Here he is. He's pondering these transcendent things, and we would think that people who become transcendent, as my mom used to say, because my dad would love to think about the things of God, and my mom says you have to be careful that you become so heavenly minded that you're no longer any earthly good. Well, you don't see that in Paul. You don't see that in Jesus. This sense of transcendent centeredness in these eternal truths, and yet grounded in care for people. The last 5 verses of chapter 1 are all about Paul's concern for the Colossian church. The very last sentence of this chapter, he says, "To this end, I strenuously contend with all the energy Christ so powerfully works in me," speaking of ministering to them. So, wrapping up, number 1. With Jesus, we no longer spend our lives scraping and grasping and struggling to get our needs met. Somehow or other, he manages that for us, internally, externally. Jesus gives us a firm grasp on transcendent things, and that is what keeps us centered. And Jesus gives us purposeful things to do in this life that serve others and keep us healthy and whole. C.S. Lewis said it this way: aim at heaven and you get the earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you get neither. Let's pray.